I want to start by sending greetings to my Russian friends and colleagues. I look forward to seeing many of you in person when I visit in April to head the jury for the documentary division of the Moscow International Film Festival. But today I speak not as a filmmaker, but as a historian. And when I think of and discuss Yalta, I focus less on the details of the agreements that were hammered out over Poland, Germany, and Japan, and I focus more on the spirit of collaboration between the leaders of the US, USSR, and Great Britain. The differences abounded, to be sure, as they had throughout the war, and it wasn't always the US and Britain against the Soviets. It was sometimes uh, Soviets and Britain against the U.S., and more often the U.S. and Soviets against Britain. Uh, and it was often, and they all wanted, they had different goals in mind and different concerns. They all wanted to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The Americans also wanted a peaceful world constructed around the United Nations that would be open to trade and penetration by U.S. capital. The Soviets wanted security, and they wanted post-war economic aid, reparations they were promised that would help rebuild their ravaged nation. As Ambassador Averell Harriman explained, the Soviets are preoccupied, quote, with security as Moscow sees it, unquote. Having been invaded at least 4 times since 1914, they wanted friendly regimes in all contiguous countries. And the Brits wanted to preserve the bloody and exploitative British Empire. The leaders worked together to come up with solutions that reflected the national security needs of all three nations. It was a win-win-win summit rather than one guided by today's zero-sum game mentality. In that sense, coming out of the horrors of World War II, the Yalta Conference was a rare moment of light, hope, and jubilation in a dark and bleak world. But let's look at the reactions at the time. The big three leaders issued a joint statement at the conclusion of the conference that expressed their hopes for the future, ones that seemed realistic at the moment. They've said, quote, our meeting here in the Crimea has reaffirmed our common determination to maintain and strengthen in the peace to come that unity of purpose and of action which has made victory possible and certain for the United Nations in this war. We believe that this is a sacred obligation which our governments owe to our peoples and to all the peoples of the world. It went on only with the continuing and growing cooperation and understanding among our three countries and among all the peace-loving nations can the highest aspiration of humanity be realized, a secure and lasting peace that will, in the words of the Atlantic Charter, quote, afford assurance that all men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want, unquote. The New York Times headlined its coverage, Moscow jubilant over Big Three Accord, and reported that Izvestia hailed the conference as, quote, the biggest political event of current times, an event that will enter in history as a new example of coordinated solutions of complicated questions in the interests of peace and democracy. Upon his return to the U.S., President Roosevelt, though exhausted, delivered a very hopeful message to Congress. And he said, the conference in the Crimea was a turning point. I hope in our history, and therefore in the history of the world, we shall have to take the responsibility for world collaboration, or we shall have to bear the responsibility for another world conflict. And I am confident that the Congress and American people will accept the results of the conference as the beginning of a permanent structure of peace upon which our children and grandchildren, yours and mine, the children and grandchildren of the whole world, must live and can live, And that, my friends, is the only message I can give you, for I feel very deeply, and I know that all of you are feeling it today and are going to feel it in the future. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's trusted advisor and confidant, shared the post-Yalta enthusiasm and said, "We really believed in our hearts that this was the dawn of the new day we had all been praying for and talking about for so many years. We were absolutely certain we had won the first great victory of the peace. And by we, I mean all of us, the whole civilized human race. The Soviets had proved reasonable and far-seeing, and there wasn't any doubt in the minds of the president or any of us that we could live with them, get along with them peacefully for as far into the future as any of us could imagine." This was a dramatic about-face for some of the earlier tensions that had surfaced. The capitalist allies had crushed Soviet hopes for a two-front war against Germany. In May 1942, Roosevelt and General Marshall promised Molotov that the U.S. would open a second front against Nazi Germany on the European continent before 1942 was out. But Churchill reneged on his commitment and blocked the operation. U.S. military leaders were furious with the Brits and condemned plans to substitute the Torch campaign in North Africa early the following year. Marshall condemned Torch as periphery pecking, and Eisenhower said the invasion would mark the blackest day in history. They knew what almost no Americans now know today, that throughout most of the war, the Soviets alone were facing more than 200 German divisions, while the US and Brits together were facing only 10. As a result, the Soviets successfully turned the tide of the Nazi onslaught and were driving the Germans back across Europe. By the time of the conference, the Red Army occupied Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, and was approaching Berlin. Contrary to subsequent U.S. myth-making, it was the Soviets, not the Americans or the Brits, who deserved the lion's share of credit for defeating Germans, as even Churchill admitted. And Roosevelt, who had lost the diplomatic initiative when the Second Front was stalled, never ceded anything at Yalta that the Soviets didn't already control. The lesson for today is that when leaders work together in a collaborative spirit that takes into account each nation's national security needs, a peaceful and prosperous world is possible. Today's world is quite different from the world of 1945. The challenges may be just as profound and serious, but with the advent of nuclear weapons 6 months after Yalta, the stakes are even higher today than they were 80 years ago. That means that the need for peaceful collaboration is even greater today than it was then, which is why I've been calling for a new global summit in the spirit of Yalta. It's time for the leaders of Russia, China, the US, India, Brazil, South Africa, perhaps a few other countries, to sit down and peacefully resolve the crises that are roiling the world on at least 4 continents and bringing us ever closer to nuclear annihilation. As Khrushchev said to Kennedy in the aftermath of the terrifying Cuban Missile Crisis, we should resolve every conflict between us that could lead to a new crisis, like the one we recently and so narrowly survived. Both leaders knew how close they had come and what a big role luck had played. With the wars ongoing today on several continents and the threat of additional wars erupting at any time in the future, today's leaders should feel the urgency that Kennedy and Khrushchev did in 1962 and 1963, and they should peacefully resolve all the ongoing conflicts. If not, we may not be so lucky the next time around. Thank you.